I was truly honored by the invitation to speak with you today. And I must confess that I also felt a little bit inadequate, daunted even, in addressing you on this occasion of honoring Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., as well as celebrating unity in Spartanburg. Recently, I met Henry Louis Gates Jr., Harvard professor, leading scholar, and public intellectual on African American research, not to mention participant in the famous or notorious beer summit called together by President Obama and after Gates was arrested breaking into his own home. I was introduced to Gates after his speaking on his use of historical genealogical research coupled with DNA analysis to help prominent African Americans discover their roots. His stories were about how much more there is to any person's history than the surface indicates. Through his research, he was encouraging an appreciation for the complexity of race and the textures and legends of families' lives. Upon shaking my hand, he immediately called me the whitest white American girl he had ever met. After my initial shock, I quickly replied, "But you haven't seen me dance yet." So, like so many others, including Bill, I have often looked to Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail as an important touchstone in terms of the lessons of leadership that it offers. When feeling intimidated by the issues and problems, large and small, before me in my work, I take inspiration in imagining that I am answering his call to be an agitator for justice and an advocate for direct, nonviolent action. As an individual whose emotions and passions sometimes overwhelm those with whom I work, I take comfort in believing that I'm an extremist for love of humankind and its potential, an extremist for justice, and most especially an extremist for education and educational access. But my reflections today are less about my own actions and leadership, and instead touch upon connectivity and community. My inspiration, interestingly enough, because we had not planned this, comes from an experience that I had with my family over Christmas, when on December 26th, 5 adults and 2 children went to see Les Miserables. It was rather moving for me, but at dinner following the movie, my nephew talked about his disbelief in the plot. It was implausible to him that someone could be imprisoned for stealing a loaf of bread to help his family or a starving child. While the adults certainly explained about hunger then and now, debtors' prisons, and desperation, my nephew seemed unconvinced. That made me wonder, how many other 12-year-olds from well-educated backgrounds are so distanced from poverty of the past and present that it seems far more far-fetched to them than zombies or intergalactic warfare? How many 12-year-olds in the U.S. today, and indeed in Spartanburg today, live in poverty and with a fearful sense of not having what he or she needs: food, clothing, a permanent and stable home, access to a quality education are there? I discovered that 15 million children, over 21% of all America's children, live below the poverty level, established at an income level of just over $22,000 for a family of 4. 24% of South Carolina's children, over 250,000 children in South Carolina, live in poverty. And approximately 17,000 children in Spartanburg County alone go hungry from Friday to Monday, when they are unable to access free and reduced meals through our school system. These families are disproportionately Black and Hispanic, and their poverty impedes their children's ability to be prepared to learn and to perform in school. It impacts their nutrition and their physical and mental health. It impacts the stability of their family and a home. It certainly increases the risk of their abuse, their neglect, and domestic violence. The current statistics for education are equally troubling. Spartanburg ranks highest in South Carolina for adults with less than a 9th grade education. Indeed, 15% fewer students from poor families graduate from high school than those in families without such desperate need. Spartanburg is lowest in our state in the number of adults with bachelor's degrees and above. Despite having 7 esteemed institutions of higher learning, only 19% of Spartanburg's adults, as compared to just under 23% of those in South Carolina, have bachelor's degrees, and 27% of adults in America having bachelor's degrees. There are more out there in our own community living on the absolute edge, at risk of stealing out of desperation, and unable to realize their full potential than I thought. This great inequity in financial resources and education prompted me to reflect upon Dr. King's mission of equity for all people and how that relates to the concept of community. In a commencement speech at Lincoln University, our country's first degree-granting historically Black institution, given in June 1961, Dr. King asserted, and I quote, "All life is interrelated. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. As long as there is poverty in the world, no man can be totally rich, even if he has $1 billion. As long as diseases are rampant and millions of people cannot expect to live more than 20 or 30 years, no man can be totally healthy, even if he just got a clean bill of health from the finest clinic in America. Strangely enough, I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. You can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the way the world is made." End quote. There are incredible global initiatives involving grants, programs, and advocacy led by the likes of Bill and Melinda Gates, the World Health Organization, and even journalist Nicholas Kristof to advance health, social justice, education, and the well-being of families going on today. These efforts are very real, worldwide manifestations of Dr. King's idea of mutuality and our interconnectedness. This important concept of the global community and the call for us to serve therein has taken precedence in the public consciousness. For some reason today, we seem to recognize, herald, and appreciate the impact and importance of service more when those serving and benefiting are far away from each other. There is perhaps a great comfort in the anonymity and distance of us helping them. It seems so much harder and much more personal to think about and serve together as a we in the local community. How many of us here feel intimidated by the prospect? How many of us feel concerned about offending or being offended by those different from ourselves in our own community. To reach across neighborhoods, congregations, skin colors, schools, and socioeconomic classes in a small community like Spartanburg, I believe takes a great amount of courage and great patience in listening and understanding. It also promises real, tangible, and direct mutual benefit. For truly, I can never be what I ought to be until you are who you ought to be. It was indeed this sense of interconnectedness that brought me to Converse 7 years ago. I returned to South Carolina to share my love of art, but I have stayed for women. And it was the numbers that fired up my agitation for justice and my extremist efforts in education. South Carolina ranks at the bottom of all states for women's educational attainment and political representation. We are at the top of all states for women and children living in poverty. I am deeply proud of the work of Converse today. 20% of our traditional undergraduate population is comprised of women of color. 37% of last year's graduating class were first-generation college students. And 45% of our current students are Pell Grant recipients, which means they are from poor and low-income families. We are an institution of access that takes immense pride in our growing diversity. But we are also aware of how important building relationships and connections are to sustaining this diversity and the opportunity and inspiration it provides. This fall, Converse introduced current African-American Converse student Arnisha White to Margaret Swindler, who in 1968 became one of the 2 first African-American students to attend Converse. Arnisha continues to connect with Mrs. Swindler and credits that relationship with giving her new courage to achieve her dreams that she sees as being built upon those of Mrs. Swindler's. But Converse is by no means alone. We are inspired and motivated by our city's history, and most especially our evolution into a community invested in mutual success. We are growing in our we-ness rather than a me-ness. This reshaping of Spartanburg into a community of connectedness and caring has been over 20 years in the making. In 1992, St. Luke's Free Medical Clinic was established to respond to a community challenge. The simple but demoralizing truth that 20% of our community had no access to medical care. It was 2 ministers, Dr. Clay Turner of the Church of the Advent and the Reverend Benjamin Snoddy of Mount Moriah Baptist Church, who galvanized their congregations to think and act differently and directly. The Reverends embraced Dr. King's mission of equity for all people and used his theme of beloved community to encourage a cross-community solution. They exchanged ideas in the pulpits and assembled study groups that brought together members of both congregations. And St. Luke's became much more than just a physical building and the health care available there. It established a new connectivity and more open conversations across our community that have continued to grow. Stop the Violence, which followed in 1995, was a citizens movement galvanized by the shooting of prominent African American Ernest Rice outside First Baptist Church of Spartanburg following an evening of his coaching his church's basketball team. The project, a totally biracial, collaborative effort, had the simple objective of peacemaking in the community. Its success, however, depended upon the creation of a strong, complicated network of community collaborators, from ministers to neighborhood associations to schools and law enforcement. These partners came together to honor and grow the culture of community in Spartanburg. Years later, Stop the Violence was heralded nationally through the award of a grant that only 7 communities in the nation received. The powerful impact of these initiatives, which succeeded only because citizens reached across conventional boundaries, has given birth to many more. Today, Spartanburg, I believe, is truly gaining momentum as a we community. Think of the North Side Revitalization Project, galvanized by an investment of $25 million by the Edward Via College of Osteopathic Medicine to build a new educational facility. A diverse group of citizens from across Spartanburg are now working together to revive this neighborhood. They have captured stories from long-standing residents about Northside's past. They have recrafted elementary education with the launch of the Cleveland Academy of Leadership. They are advancing retail, housing, healthcare, and safety, all to rejuvenate this important neighborhood in our city. Think of the challenge 40-30, which aims to have 40% of our adults attain bachelor's degrees by 2030, and our new college hub that brings together educators, business, and religious leaders, as well as concerned citizens in driving new initiatives to meet this goal. Think about the opening of Meeting Street Academy in downtown Spartanburg and the expansion of universal 4K readiness programs across our county. These permit our youngest citizens to experience the diversity and the opportunity of education. We must look after our own children and our neighbors' children too. I must educate the students of Converse, and I must work to ensure that all students in our K-12 systems and all adults with the desire and potential for a college education have access to it. As I think about Professor Gates' remarks, I know that I cannot change how I look on the outside, but I can certainly continue to grow on the inside, becoming all I ought to be as long as I help you be all you ought to be. I invite you today to serve with a purpose of being what you ought to be by helping another be what he or she ought to be. Reach across your neighborhood, your institution, your congregation, your generation, your skin color, and your socioeconomic class. Expand your relationships, your connections, and the focus of your care, concern, and compassion. Aim to work toward the larger purpose of we, helping Spartanburg to continue to build the character of our community and truly become a community in which people regularly work together to achieve common goals. If so, everybody wins and nobody loses. And the legacy of Dr. King continues to live on. Thank you.